January 12, 1943. Southwestern edge of Stalingrad. A pale winter sun hangs low over the ruins, casting long shadows across the broken city. The wind drags fine crystals of snow through the shattered windows of what used to be a factory office, whispering across collapsed beams and frozen brick. Inside, in a corner where the roof still holds, a lone Soviet sniper steadies his breathing. His rifle rests on a mound of rubble. His hands tremble not from the cold, but from the weight of another day spent proving himself to men who believed he had no place here. They had called him slow, nervous, a burden on the squad. Below him, German troops shuffle between makeshift positions, their silhouettes flickering in the haze of smoke and distant fires. The sniper watches through cracked glass, searching for a single figure among dozens. His heart beats slower now, every breath drawn with purpose. He knows that one shot, just one, could change the fate of his unit. And for the first time, he feels the possibility that it might change something else as well. That quiet moment, suspended over a frozen battlefield, leads us into the world that made such a shot necessary. In the winter of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had reached its most brutal phase. Stalingrad, once an industrial city on the Volga, had become a labyrinth of shattered factories, twisted iron beams, and pulverized concrete. What began months earlier as a German drive to seize the oil-rich southern territories had devolved into a frozen stalemate of street by street, room by room fighting. Every staircase, every half-demolished wall, every burnt-out vehicle offered cover for men trying simply to survive the next hour. By early January, the German Sixth Army was trapped. Surrounded by Soviet forces of the Don Front, they were starving, exhausted, and bleeding strength with each passing day. Operation Uranus had closed the encirclement weeks earlier, but the Germans still held pockets of resistance across the city's western districts. Their supply lines, once a direct artery from the steppe, were now reduced to irregular airdrops that often landed behind Soviet lines. Commanders struggled to coordinate troops whose morale had sunk under the pressure of relentless bombardments and the creeping certainty of defeat. On the Soviet side, the Red Army's grip tightened steadily. Although still battered from months of attrition, their supply routes remained intact. Reinforcements flowed in from across the Volga. Fresh rifles, ammunition crates, and replacement soldiers crossed the river under the cover of darkness or snowstorms. Among these men were specialist sappers, machine gunners, mortar teams, and increasingly, snipers. Sniper warfare had become one of the defining features of Stalingrad. The city's ruins created a hunter's paradise. Every collapsed wall could serve as a firing nest. Holes blasted through floors offered vertical lines of fire. Even charred pipes or abandoned chimneys became lookout points for marksmen, waiting hours for a single decisive moment. Long before the cold set in, the Soviets had recognized the psychological power of a hidden rifleman. German troops had begun calling them ghosts, unseen, patient, and terrifyingly precise. Across the trenches and rubble fields, German units responded with their own sharpshooters. Many experienced hunters from rural regions of Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia. Their rifles were reliable, their optics sharp, and their training disciplined. The battle between snipers became a silent duel layered atop the larger struggle raging across the city. Amid this chaos, inexperienced replacements were pushed into specialized roles they did not always understand. Commanders were forced to fill gaps quickly, sometimes promoting men who lacked the confidence or temperament for precision shooting. The Red Army needed snipers desperately, but not all who were sent forward were ready for the psychological and technical demands of the role. It was in this environment that a young Manan apprentice machinist before the war found himself labeled useless by those around him. His initial performance in the line had been hesitant. He froze under artillery fire, struggled to adjust to the brutal tempo of frontline life, and often failed to spot threats that more seasoned soldiers saw instantly. When a senior officer reassigned him to sniper duty after a brief training course, many assumed it was simply a way to move him out of the main rifle platoons. But the front had no room for weakness. he was laughed at quietly, dismissed openly, ignored when orders were handed out. The stigma was heavy, especially in a city where legendary snipers like Vasily Zaitsev had become symbols of Soviet resilience. To be considered incapable in the shadow of such figures was a burden carried like an extra pack of bricks across the battlefield. Yet despite the whispers and wary glances, he was learning. Each night, he memorized the layout of the ruins from crude maps. Each morning, he rehearsed breath control and trigger discipline in the sub-zero cold. He studied how wind moved smoke, how light reflected off rifle barrels, how footsteps echoed differently across debris. But none of it mattered until he had the chance to prove that he belonged. By January 1943, that chance hovered closer with every day of tightening German desperation. Ranked officers were forced into exposed positions to coordinate dwindling defenses. Snipers on both sides understood that a single well-placed shot could unravel a command post, silence an observer, or collapse the morale of a unit already stretched thin. As the fighting intensified in the city's western districts, one crucial target emerged, one that demanded the steady hands of a marksman, even an underestimated one. And the unfolding situation around Stalingrad created exactly the conditions that would bring the young sniper to that frozen window on January 12, 1943. The shifting momentum on the battlefield sets the stage for the more intimate context behind his story. The western blocks of Stalingrad had become a patchwork of Soviet advances and German holdouts, with lines that shifted not by kilometers, but by meters. A single ruined apartment could be Soviet territory on the first floor, German on the second, and contested on the stairwell. In this fragmented battlefield, snipers were not just hunters, they were anchors. Their presence could freeze enemy movement, silence machine gun nests, or protect advancing infantry as they crossed open kill zones of shattered streets. The Red Army understood this, and by late 1942 it had institutionalized sniper tactics with impressive efficiency. New recruits, regardless of background, were cycled through rapid training programs where they learned camouflage, range judgment, stalking techniques, and the art of patient observation. But the programs were rushed. Many trainees had barely held a rifle a few months earlier. They learned foundational skills, but lacked the confidence that only experience could build. The young machinist-turned-sniper had completed one of these accelerated courses. His instructors noted his careful, methodical nature traits that could make a good marksman, but he struggled under pressure. Loud noises rattled him. Sudden movement distracted him. During live-fire exercises, he hesitated. His accuracy was acceptable, sometimes even good, but never remarkable. And in a war shaped by extraordinary feats, acceptable was often read as not enough. When he arrived at his assigned sniper team, the reception was cold. His spotter, a corporal hardened by months of survival in Stalingrad's ruins, had no patience for a man who lacked confidence. The squad joked about him being dead weight, a liability in a battlefield where hesitation could kill entire teams. Even other snipers avoided pairing with him, uncomfortable with the idea of relying on someone whose hands shook when he first climbed into a firing position. Yet there was a deeper truth buried beneath their scorn. Many of these men had started the same way, uncertain, afraid, unproven. The difference was that they had been forced into moments where hesitation was not an option. Moments that refined their instincts like steel under heat. The young sniper had simply not faced that moment yet. And in Stalingrad, those moments came whether you wanted them or not. German positions in early January were reorganizing constantly. Officers were forced to expose themselves while coordinating retreats from one ruin to another. Runners crossed open gaps to carry messages once radios failed or froze. Artillery observers climbed elevated rubble to direct fire against Soviet counterattacks. These movements created opportunities but also intense competition among Soviet sharpshooters who vied to eliminate high-value targets. Commanders began assigning overlapping sniper pairs to sectors where German officers were most likely to appear. In one such sector, near the ruins of the Barricadi factory, Intelligence reported that a German staff officer, possibly a battalion-level commander, was establishing a temporary command post in the remnants of an office block. The building's skeletal frame gave him a vantage point over both the riverbank and a nearby street intersection. If left unchallenged, he could direct the local defenses with devastating efficiency. The sniper squads in the area were stretched thin. Several veterans were already engaged in duels with experienced German marksmen. Others were relocated to protect Soviet sappers preparing demolition charges along the railway lines. The sector commander needed anyone positioned to watch the German-held office. There were few options left. So the order came down. The young sniper, mocked by his peers and doubted even by himself, was to take position overlooking the building. His spotter protested, arguing that the assignment was too critical to waste on an unproven marksman. But orders were orders, and hesitation among officers was impossible with so many fronts competing for manpower. That is how he found himself climbing into a half-destroyed office room on the morning of January 12th. Snow clung to his greatcoat. His breath clouded in the frigid air. He carried with him not confidence, but a sense of obligation, a desperate need to finally show he belonged, or at least to stop proving his doubters right. From that position, surrounded by the brittle quiet of winter and the distant echo of artillery, his world narrowed to a single window frame and a single target. And the broader conflict shaping Stalingrad pressed him toward the moment that would define everything that followed. The stage was set for the angles through which this story must now be understood. In every war, there are men who enter the battlefield carrying more than weapons. They carry doubt, quiet, corrosive, invisible. For the young sniper in the frozen shell of Stalingrad, doubt had become a constant companion long before he ever climbed into that firing position. It followed him from training grounds to frontline trenches, whispering in moments of silence and growing louder each time another soldier dismissed him with a glance or an offhand remark. To his comrades, he seemed fragile. He avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and moved with the uncertain posture of someone who felt perpetually out of place. The brutal honesty of frontline culture carved into him quickly. Soldiers judged one another not by promises or polite words, but by what they delivered in moments of danger. He had not delivered much. Not yet. His family back home had considered him thoughtful, intelligent, slow to anger, a young man better suited for building machines than destroying them. But war had no patience for gentle dispositions. In Stalingrad, softness was interpreted as weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Every soldier in his unit had witnessed friends fall within arm's reach. Every hesitation had a cost. Every mistake left a mark. Survival forged camaraderie, but it also created pressure. When others excelled, he felt the comparison like a blade. When they trained, he trained harder. When they slept, he studied rifle mechanics by lantern light or practiced breath control in the cold until his fingertips numbed. None of it earned respect. The battlefield was meritocratic in the harshest way. Improvement mattered only when proven under fire. What kept him going was not pride, nor ambition, but something quieter, a refusal to be remembered as the one who failed when others held the line. It was that inner struggle, invisible to the men around him, that shaped the psychological landscape from which his single defining shot would emerge. And as the German encirclement tightened and officers grew more exposed on the battlefield, he sensed his moment approaching, carried not by confidence, but by necessity. The battlefield of Stalingrad transformed the role of the sniper from a supporting marksman into a central figure of urban warfare. Streets were ravines of shattered brick. Corridors of collapsed factories offered overlapping fields of fire. Rubble hills created vantage points that rivaled rooftops. In this environment, the young sniper operated under a tactical doctrine that had evolved rapidly during the city siege. Soviet snipers were taught to move with the rhythm of the battlefield. Maximum patience, minimum exposure. They learned to read wind through drifting smoke, gauge distance by the size of a helmet in the scope, and anticipate enemy movement by listening to boots scraping across broken glass. A good sniper might work alone, but a great one operated as part of the landscape shaping enemy choices without ever revealing his presence. His assigned position that January morning was tactically ideal. The collapsed office gave him partial cover, with a narrow firing slit through fractured concrete. Snow muffled sound. Debris around him formed a natural brace for the rifle. From this vantage, he could observe German movements across a small intersection, including the suspected command post housed in the exposed office block opposite him. Yet tactics involved more than the geometry of angles and lines of sight. A sniper needed composure, timing, and discipline to withstand the hours of stillness required to identify a meaningful target. German counter-snipers were everywhere. A careless silhouette or glint of metal could bring instant retaliation. The slightest misjudgment, breathing at the wrong moment, shifting weight too loudly, exposing a shoulder, could end a life before a shot was ever fired. As he settled into the rubble, he ran through the fundamentals drilled into him during training. Stabilize the rifle, control the breath, adjust for wind, account for distance. Wait. But battlefield reality was seldom textbook. Smoke drifted unpredictably. Light shifted as artillery stirred dust into the air. German movements below rarely followed neat patterns. Even so, the tactical conditions aligned in a way that only snipers understood. High-value targets were surfacing with increasing frequency. Officers darted from cover to coordinate retreats. Field telephones changed hands. Enemy spotters climbed wreckage to direct fire. It was a sniper's environment, one where patience was just as deadly as a bullet. And it was within this tactical arena that he was about to make the decision that would define not only the day, but his reputation forever. His rifle was a Mosin-Nagant M91/30, the standard sniper weapon of the Red Army. It was not elegant. It was not particularly smooth. But in the right hands, it was lethal. The long barrel provided stability, the bolt action was rugged and reliable, even in freezing conditions where more delicate mechanisms jammed. The PU scope mounted above the bore was simple, durable, and surprisingly clear when properly aligned. Yet the weapon had limits every sniper knew intimately. The scope's narrow field of view made rapid scanning impossible. Magnification was modest, forcing marksmen to rely heavily on naked eye observation. Parallax issues required consistent cheek weld, even slight shifts in head position could distort the sight picture. Cold weather stiffened the bolt, delayed trigger brakes, and tightened the rifle sling around winter clothing. The young sniper understood these imperfections better than most. His background as a machinist had made him attentive to small mechanical details. He cleaned his rifle obsessively, ensuring no ice crystals formed in the chamber. He adjusted the elevation drum with careful precision, compensating for the estimated 180-200 meters separating him from the German-held office. Still, technology alone would not deliver the result. Snipers learned quickly that a rifle was only as steady as the hands behind it. Many believed that the finest optics meant victory in truth. Clarity was meaningless without clarity of mind. And on that morning, in that ruined office, both rifle and shooter were being tested beyond their previous limits. As he studied the drifting smoke and the faint figures moving among the ruins opposite him, the moment began to build quietly, first through movement, then through recognition, and finally through a narrowing focus that felt like the world itself was drawing taut. That tightening focus leads directly into the remaining angles that shaped this moment. Leadership in Stalingrad was measured not only in orders given, but in the willingness to expose oneself to danger to ensure those orders were understood. By early 1943, the German front line had fractured into isolated pockets, and commanders found themselves navigating a battlefield where communication lines collapsed as quickly as buildings. Radios were unreliable. Field telephones were severed by rubble or buried under snow. Runners were killed or became disoriented in the maze of ruins. This made officers unusually visible. They had to move between positions, visibly directing machine gun crews, reinforcing weak points, or reorganizing defensive sectors that shrank with every Soviet push. Each appearance carried enormous risk, but also necessity. Without leadership, entire units could disintegrate into uncoordinated clusters of survivors. Soviet forces recognized this. Eliminating a single German officer could freeze an entire street's worth of defenders. It could halt a counterattack, silence a bombardment, or unravel a planned retreat. Snipers were instructed to prioritize these figures when possible. And on January 12, intelligence pointed clearly to the presence of a junior officer, likely a Hauptmann, operating from the ruined office block across from the young sniper's position. The Soviet sector commander faced a simple problem. Every experienced sniper in the vicinity was already engaged. The battlefield was too stretched, the demand for sharpshooters exceeded their availability. Sending an untested marksman was not ideal, but it was a decision made in the context of dozens of simultaneous pressures. Advancing infantry, counter-sniper duels, faltering supply lines, and the unpredictable ebb and flow of urban battle. For the young sniper, this hierarchy of necessity meant his moment was not a ceremonial opportunity, it was a direct consequence of battlefield math. Command couldn't wait for confidence to develop. They needed a rifle in place. They needed a shot taken if the opportunity arose. And the German leadership, moving through the exposed ruins in a last attempt to steady their collapsing lines, unknowingly stepped into the sights of a man desperate to shed the doubts that had shadowed him since the day he first put on his uniform. The Germans holding out in the western districts of Stalingrad. Soviet snipers had become an almost mythical threat. They were unpredictable, capable of freezing movement across entire sectors. Many German soldiers moved through ruins with a constant, low-level dread of every window felt like an eye, every piece of rubble a concealed muzzle. Officers were particularly vulnerable. Their uniforms, posture, and responsibilities made them obvious targets. This tension shaped German behavior profoundly. They hugged walls, crouched low behind debris, and avoided open courtyards whenever possible. Yet necessity forced exposure. Messages had to be delivered. Defensive positions had to be reorganized. And the shrinking perimeter meant that movement became more concentrated, not less. There were fewer safe paths, fewer blind spots, fewer alternate routes. German countersnipers were skilled and equipped with excellent optics. Many came from hunting traditions, bringing with them decades of experience reading terrain and tracking targets. Their presence made the battlefield a silent jewel layered atop the broader struggle. Every Soviet sniper knew that the moment his position was revealed, a German marksman would respond with deadly precision. But the Germans, too, faced shortages. Fatigue, frostbite, limited ammunition, and the constant pressure of Soviet artillery reduced their effectiveness. Some counter-snipers had been reassigned to frontline infantry roles simply because manpower demands became overwhelming. Others were trapped in isolated ruins without clear fields of fire, their rifles rendered useless by the changing landscape of the battle. On the morning of January 12, German troops in the office block across from the young sniper worked under the assumption that Soviet sharpshooters were focused elsewhere. The heavy fighting to the south had drawn many Soviet marksmen out of the immediate area. Movement seemed momentarily safer. This lapse in caution created the opening that the young sniper was waiting for. And beneath the tension of German uncertainty was the growing moral weight that would shape his decision in the minutes ahead. In a battle where thousands died each week, the idea that a single bullet could carry moral weight might seem improbable. Yet snipers understood this burden more intimately than most soldiers. Their work was deliberate, not reactive. They chose their targets. They watched their targets. They waited for the exact moment when life and death narrowed into a single heartbeat. For the young sniper, the moral dimension of his role had always been blurred. He was not a seasoned killer hardened by months of combat. He was a machinist who once built tools and measured tolerances by thousandths of a millimeter. The transition from crafting precision parts to dealing precision death had never felt natural. Each time he settled behind the scope, he remembered the first life he took a German rifleman crossing an alley. The shot had been clean, but the memory was not. It clung to him, resurfacing in the quiet moments between bombardments. Yet war rarely grants the luxury of moral hesitation. In Stalingrad, hesitation meant the death of comrades, or the collapse of a fragile defensive line. The knowledge that his inaction could cost others their lives became a stronger weight than the guilt of pulling the trigger. The battlefield forced a grim equation upon him. Choose a life so that others might survive. When word reached him that a German officer might appear in the window across the intersection, an officer responsible for coordinating enemy fire, he understood the implications immediately. Such a target was not just another silhouette, it was a node of command, a point of influence. Eliminating it could save Soviet soldiers who fought only meters away behind crumbling walls. As he steadied his rifle on the morning of January 12th, these moral currents converged. Personal shame, responsibility to comrades, the brutal calculus of war, all of it distilled into a moment of stillness. And that stillness is what carries us directly into the moments when everything changed. The cold inside the ruined office felt heavier as the morning deepened. Snow drifted through gaps where the ceiling had collapsed, settling quietly on shattered desks and twisted metal beams. The young sniper lay prone behind his rifle, his cheek pressed against the worn wooden stock. Every breath formed a thin mist against the frigid air, dissipating slowly before the next inhale. He had been in position for over an hour. His fingers, numb beneath wool gloves, curled carefully around the trigger guard. His other hand steadied the forend of the rifle, thumb resting near the sling mount he always used as a tactile anchor. Beneath him, the rubble felt a live metal contracting in the cold wood, creaking softly beneath shifting weight. Every sound mattered. Every vibration meant something. Across the narrow intersection, the German-held office block stood wounded but still functional. Chunks of wall had collapsed inward. Wooden beams leaned at awkward angles where floors had given way. Yet amid the wreckage, the Germans had carved out a command post. He could see silhouettes moving, occasionally helmeted shadows passing behind fractured windows. Men carrying papers, smoke rising from a stovepipe punched through a cracked wall. He knew the target was inside. Intelligence had been precise. A German Hauptmann had taken charge of a shrinking defensive pocket and was believed to be coordinating fire from this vantage point. If the officer appeared even briefly, the sniper's task was clear. But clarity did not calm his nerves. Every heartbeat felt amplified against the stillness. He listened for anything that might signal enemy awareness. The distant click of a bolt, the sharp crack of a counter-sniper round, the warning murmur of boots crunching on glass. None came. Not yet. He shifted slightly, careful not to dislodge loose rubble. The scope aligned with the opposite building. Through the narrow field of view, the world became a tunnel, dark, focused, intimate. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light. Smoke curled from a shattered window. Then movement. A German soldier stepped into view, carrying a map case. Not the target. The sniper tracked him carefully but did not lift the safety catch. The man paused, scanned the street, then disappeared deeper into the ruin. Moments stretched. The sniper blinked slowly, letting his eyes rest before returning to the scope. Fatigue blurred judgment, he could not afford it. Minutes passed. Then a sudden, sharp metallic sound echoed, faintly, sheet metal scraping, followed by hurried footsteps. His heart quickened. He pressed his cheek firmly into the stock, repositioning the crosshair. Through the window across the way, he caught a glimpse of an officer's cap. A grey coat. Broad shoulders. The unmistakable bearing of command. The Hauptmann stepped into the open window frame, peering down toward the street, as if assessing movement below. His profile became clear, sharply cut features, a thin wool scarf wrapped around his neck, the silver edge of a shoulder board glinting faintly in the cold light. He was exposed, standing in exactly the spot the sniper's commanders had predicted. The sniper inhaled deeply, filling his lungs. He let half the breath out and held the rest, stabilizing his heartbeat. His right index finger found the trigger, resting gently on its curved metal. The world narrowed further. Sound faded. Movement slowed. It was as though the ruins around him dissolved, leaving only the faint sway of a man in a window 180 meters away. He checked bullet drop mentally minimal. Wind drifts light, left to right, barely enough to adjust. He shifted the crosshair a hair's width. His gloves felt stiff, but he maintained control. His breathing steadied. He whispered nothing to himself. There were no words. Only the silent discipline drilled into him through months of training and the quiet desperation to prove he belonged. The officer raised binoculars to his eyes. That was the moment. The sniper squeezed, not pulled. A smooth, measured pressure. The trigger broke like the snack of a frozen twig. The rifle cracked short, violent, echoing sharply through the ruins. A burst of recoil pushed into his shoulder. Smoke curled from the barrel, drifting toward the broken window like a thin ghost. Through the scope, he saw the impact immediately. The German officer's head snapped backward. The binoculars flew from his hands. His body crumpled, collapsing sideways out of view. Men inside the building shouted, voices rising in confusion and alarm. The sniper exhaled sharply, then pressed himself lower into the rubble. He waited. Counter-snipers might fire instantly. Rifle shots might follow. But none came. The Germans inside the office scrambled, dragging the fallen officer deeper into the ruin, shouting orders that wavered with panic. He had done it. The shot was clean. Precise. Final. But the moment was not over. Not yet. The battlefield does not pause for reflection, even when a single bullet shifts its balance. And in the seconds that followed, the consequences of that shot began unfolding across the frozen intersection. Those consequences form the second half of the climax. For a few seconds after the shot, the city held its breath. The sniper kept his body pressed flat, cheek to cold stone, watching the German-held building through the narrowest sliver of his scope. His pulse thudded in his ears, louder than the distant thumps of artillery. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the ruined window frame as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Then the world snapped awake. Shouts erupted from the German position, sharp, frantic, overlapping. Shadows darted across the broken interior. Men scrambled for cover, rifles raised, helmets catching pale sunlight as they dove behind overturned desks and half-collapsed walls. He watched a stretcher team appear, 2 soldiers bending to retrieve the limp body of the Hauptmann. Their movements were hurried, disjointed. One slipped on loose debris, cursing loudly. The sniper noted it all with a strange, analytic detachment. His work was supposed to end with the trigger pull bot. It never truly did. He waited for the counter-sniper shot. It was inevitable. Killing an officer of that rank would provoke an immediate response. His heart tightened, anticipating the sudden punch of a round hitting near his position. His muscles tensed, prepared to roll to a secondary firing point. But seconds passed. Then tens of seconds. Still nothing. That meant something. Either there was no German sniper in the sector or the one assigned hadn't yet located him. Or worse, the counter-sniper was patiently searching, biding time, waiting for the smallest mistake. That uncertainty was a cold weight pressing into the back of his skull. He slowly shifted away from the scope and scanned the interior of the room. The ruined office reeked faintly of smoke and dust. Broken furniture lay scattered like bones. Frost clung to the edges of shattered glass. To his left, a collapsed beam jutted from the ceiling, draped with snow like a crooked arm pointing toward the street. He listened. Boots. Soft crunches. Distant clanking. German voices drifting through the ruins, more organized now, coordinating a search pattern. "They're coming," he whispered to himself, not in fear but in acknowledgement. He crawled backward from the firing slit, careful not to silhouette himself against the dim light. His breath fogged and vanished in the cold air as he reached a secondary position behind an overturned metal desk. From here he could still cover the street below, though with a narrower angle. Then he saw them. A pair of German soldiers emerged from behind a burned-out truck near the intersection. They moved low and quick, rifles held ready, advancing toward the building where the sniper lay hidden. Their breath showed in short bursts. They hugged the debris, making use of every scrap of cover. These men were not panicked, they were disciplined, purposeful. More followed. 4, then 6. A small squad forming a tight wedge. They weren't retreating. They were hunting. The sniper felt a pinprick of dread in his stomach. He had expected retaliation, but not so soon, and not with this coordination. The hauptman he had killed must have been important enough that his men felt the immediate need to neutralize the threat. Or perhaps the command structure had grown desperate, clawing for stability. He steadied his rifle again, resting it atop the bent desk frame. His fingers tightened around the stock. He controlled his breathing, slowing it until each inhale felt like drawing ice into his lungs. He tracked the lead soldier through the scope. The man carried a submachine gun and wore a heavy scarf, frost clinging to the fabric. His boots crunched rhythmically as he approached the base of the sniper's building. A clean shot. A sure shot. But the sniper hesitated. Shooting now would confirm his exact position. And once the Germans knew where he was, they might lob grenades, or worse, call in a mortar strike. The building was already fragile, a single direct shell would collapse his section completely. He held his fire. The squad advanced closer, moving along the side wall. Their voices were lower now, harder to pick apart. He caught fragments, orders, signals, warnings. Clack. A small sound echoed behind him. He froze. It had been faint, almost indistinguishable from the settling of debris. But it wasn't debris. It had a rhythm of footstep, hesitant, careful. Someone was inside the building. His muscles coiled. His breathing stopped. He slowly slid his hand from the rifle stock to the pistol holstered at his side. He hadn't expected the Germans to infiltrate so quickly. The lower floors must have been breached already, or they had entered through a gap in the wall where the structure collapsed. Another step. Then another. Closer now. The sniper gripped the pistol, cold metal biting into his gloved palm. He felt the tremor return to his hands, the same tremor he fought during training, the one others mocked. He tightened his jaw, steadying himself. The ruined office grew impossibly quiet, except for the faint crunch of approaching boots. Shadows shifted near the door was low, deliberate movement. The sniper lowered his breathing to a whisper, heart hammering. A German soldier stepped into view. He wore a heavy coat dusted with snow. His rifle was raised, bayonet fixed. The man's eyes swept the room, sharp and methodical. He paused, studying the collapsed beams, the overturned desk. Then his gaze drifted toward the sniper. Their eyes met. The world snapped taut. The German inhaled sharply, raising his rifle. The sniper fired first. The pistol cracked at close range. The German jerked backward, crashing into a mound of rubble with a muffled cry. His rifle clattered in stone, sliding from his grasp. The sniper scrambled to reposition, adrenaline flooding through him. More footsteps thundered from below, shouts, boots pounding up shattered stairs. They were coming fast. He grabbed his rifle and crawled to the far corner, where a narrow service hatch led to the adjoining room. He squeezed through just as a burst of gunfire tore into the space he had occupied seconds before. Wooden splinters and shards of metal rained across the floor. He moved deeper into the next roomer half-collapsed storage area and braced himself behind a broken shelving unit. His lungs burned. His hands shook. But his mind was sharp, focused. This was no longer a duel across a battlefield. This was survival. And the consequences of that single shot at the Hauptmann were still unfolding around him, one breath at a time. The building groaned under its own shattered weight as the sniper steadied himself in the narrow storage room. Dust drifted from the rafters with every distant explosion. The Germans were moving methodically, now no panic, no wasted motion. They knew exactly what they were hunting, and the sniper could hear their confidence in the sharp cadence of their footsteps. He wiped a thin streak of blood from his cheek. A shard of brick must have grazed him when the last burst tore into the other room. The cold air stung the cut, sharpening his senses. He pressed his back against the crumbling wall and listened closely. A voice barked an order from the stairwell. Another answered, closer this time. Boots scraped against concrete. They were spreading out, splitting into two teams. One was clearing the upper corridor, the other was circling around the far landing. They were determined to trap him, cut off every escape route, and close in with overwhelming force. It was the kind of response usually reserved for rooting out machine gun nests or eliminating a sniper who had just decapitated a command post. He lifted his rifle, careful not to let the barrel scrape against loose debris. Through a gap in the shelving unit, he glimpsed movement's shadow crossing the next room, just a few meters away. A helmet, the glint of a rifle barrel. Then the silhouette vanished again. He adjusted his breath, slow, deliberate. But firing would only paint a target on his position. He needed time. A few seconds. Just enough for the squad advancing above to step into view where he could predict their angle. Another boot step. Heavy. Close. Then the sound of metal scraping against the floor. A German soldier was dragging something probing, testing the room just ahead. He was using the toe of his boot to push debris aside, clearing a line of movement. The sniper's pulse sharpened. The soldier stepped through the doorway, rifle raised at shoulder height. He scanned left first, exactly as doctrine prescribed. That was his mistake. The sniper fired a single shot. The man dropped instantly, collapsing backward with a grunt, rifle clattering against the concrete. The echo of the gunshot slammed through the corridor, magnified by the hollow ruins. Shouts erupted immediately. Two more Germans rushed into the adjoining room, firing blindly toward the shelving. Splinters exploded from the boards. A bullet hissed past his ear, embedding itself in the stone behind him with a violent crack. He ducked low and rolled, pressing his shoulder against the cold floor. His breath came in sharp bursts now. He crawled toward a broken ventilation shaft in the corner, a narrow square opening, barely wider than his shoulders. It led to a maintenance crawl space, one he had spotted earlier, but hoped he wouldn't need. He needed it now. He slung the rifle across his chest, gripped the edge of the opening, and slid inside. The metal scraped against his coat, biting into the fabric. He exhaled, shrinking his profile as much as possible. Gunfire raked across the shelves behind him. Then boots thundered into the storage room. He pulled himself deeper into the shaft, inching forward in darkness. The air smelled of rust and dust. The narrow walls pressed against his shoulders and spine. Behind him, he heard the Germans enter the room, fully boots crunching over debris, voices sharp and frustrated. A flashlight beam swept across the entrance of the shaft. He froze. The beam hovered, wavered, then moved on. One of the soldiers muttered something under his breath. Another kicked the fallen shelving, sending a metallic crash ringing through the cramped crawl space. They hadn't seen him. Not yet. He waited. 10 seconds. 15. When the voices shifted back toward the corridor, he resumed crawling, pushing forward with slow, deliberate movements. The metal walls vibrated with distant artillery strikes. Snow filtered through cracks somewhere above him, melting against the warm fabric of his coat before dripping silently onto the floor. Finally, the passage opened into a small maintenance alcove overlooking the northern street. A shattered window provided a line of sight limited, but usable. He wiped grime from his gloves and steadied the rifle on the narrow ledge. Below, the German squad regrouped around the building's entrance. The officer now leading them was shouting orders, gesturing aggressively toward the upper floors. The men spread out, forming a defensive perimeter, while others stacked near the doorway to continue their search. He recognized the pattern. They thought he was cornered. They thought he was inside the building still, hiding in the upper level. And that gave him the first true advantage since the shot that started all of this. He lined up his sight. For a brief moment, the wind calmed. Snowflakes hovered before drifting downward in a slow spiral. The officer stepped into view. The sniper exhaled. One measured breath. One steady trigger pull. The rifle cracked. The officer dropped, collapsing against the wall in a spray of snow and dust. The squad erupted into confusion. Men dove for cover, shouting and scattering behind shattered vehicles and collapsed masonry. Their certainty dissolved in an instant. The sniper had escaped the trap. And with that second decisive shot, he had undone the short-lived stability they tried so desperately to reclaim. Down below, German troops scrambled to pull the wounded officer to safety. Others searched the rooftops in panic, firing sporadically at shadows. The sniper pulled back from the window, silent, breath steady. He knew the cycle would repeat: search teams, counter-snipers, retaliation. But the balance had already shifted. What began as a moment of desperation had become something else entirely. Proof. Proof to his comrades. Proof to his commanders. Proof to himself. And the city, frozen and broken around him, seemed to acknowledge it with a long, silent breath. The ruins of the factory district grew quiet again as the sniper withdrew from the window and sank deeper into the maze of shattered rooms. The echo of his second kill, the officer, who had attempted to restore control, still drifted through the frozen air like a fading ripple. But the intensity of the hunt eased. German troops pulled back from the building, dragging their wounded, abandoning the push that only minutes earlier had seemed inevitable. A strange calm settled over the sector. Calm in Stalingrad was never peace. It was simply the moment between storms. The sniper found shelter in a narrow recess between two collapsed support beams. From here, he could listen without being seen. The Germans were reorganizing, their voices lower now, less certain, marked by the realization that the threat was not something they could easily isolate and crush. They moved with hesitancy, trying to form a defensive cordon rather than an aggressive sweep. Their confidence that vital force that held units together under the unimaginable pressure of urban warfare had cracked. One rifle shot had started the fracture. The second had split it wide open. He allowed himself a long exhale, feeling the burn of cold air in his lungs. His hands still trembled from the adrenaline. His heartbeat slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. Hours passed. Wind swept through the shattered structures in long, lonely gusts. Sporadic gunfire echoed from distant streets. The city never slept, but the front line shifted its energy with the light. Afternoon edged toward evening, and the shadowed edges of Stalingrad grew darker and more uncertain. Only when he felt the German presence thin along the adjacent blocks did the sniper begin the slow, careful journey back towards Soviet lines. He moved through alleys of broken brick and burned-out vehicles. Each step was cautious, deliberate, testing every piece of ground before transferring weight. Every ruined factory and collapsed stairwell hid shadows capable of ending a life in an instant. The city consumed the careless. By the time he neared the Soviet strongpoint, a barricaded basement reinforced with steel doors and ice skate sandbags, his muscles ached with exhaustion. The smell of smoke, sweat, and gun oil seeped through the cracks. He tapped a coded rhythm on the metal sheet blocking the entrance. The door opened a crack, revealing the familiar face of a sergeant. At first, the man simply stared. The sniper's uniform was torn, dust-caked, scraped raw by stone. A thin line of dried blood marked his cheek. But in his eyes there was a steadiness, something unmistakably changed. The sergeant stepped aside. Inside, the cramped shelter buzzed with quiet tension. Soldiers huddled around a small makeshift stove, their breath rising in faint clouds. A medic was tending a wounded man in the corner. The low rumble of artillery rolled faintly through the earth overhead. The sniper lowered his rifle onto a crate. The squad leader approached with a hard, measuring expression. "You made it back," he said simply. For a moment, the sniper wasn't sure how to respond. The squad leader had been among those who doubted him, who assumed he lacked the aggression or instincts needed to survive this hell. But the man now stood silently, studying him as if seeing something unfamiliar. Another soldier spoke first. They heard the Germans shouting something about an officer. "Was that you?" The sniper didn't nod, didn't boast. He only cleaned the frost that clung to his rifle sight and let the silence answer for him. Around the room, a subtle shift took place. Doubt, once the unspoken atmosphere surrounding him began to thin. Men who once avoided his gaze now looked at him with something closer to respect. War was a brutal accountant. It measured worth in survival, impact, and the lives saved by the decisions of a single fighter. He had earned his place. By evening, the word had spread beyond the basement. Other units picked up fragments of the story. A sniper, written off as unreliable, had cut down not one but two German officers in the same day, breaking a counterattack that might have overwhelmed the Soviet foothold in that sector. It wasn't a heroic myth. It wasn't grand strategy. It was a single man who refused to fail when everything around him told him he would. And in Stalingrad, that was enough to change more than reputations. It could change the momentum of an entire street. Night fell over Stalingrad like a heavy curtain, swallowing what little warmth the winter sun had offered. The front began to crackle with the usual rhythm of darkness, sporadic rifle shots, the distant clatter of machine guns, the low groan of the wounded being moved under cover. But within the Soviet-held basement, the mood had shifted in a way that was almost intangible. Respect in war was never granted freely. It had to be earned, often brutally. And now, without ceremony or declaration, the sniper found himself no longer dismissed as a liability. Men spoke to him differently, less impatience, less skepticism. The subtle roll of tired eyes he once received disappeared. A cleared space was made for him near the stove. A cup of weak, steaming tea was pushed into his hands. He drank slowly, letting the heat seep through numb fingers. The squad leader sat beside him, boots stretched toward the small flame. "You should report the kills," the sergeant said quietly, not as an order, but as acknowledgement. The sniper stared into the tiny fire. Flames struggled against the draft, fluttering weakly. "They'll confirm it," he replied. The Germans pulled their officers back through the street. "Someone will have seen." The sergeant nodded. In this battle, where every alleyway and ruin was watched by desperate eyes, every action had witnesses. Word of the disrupted German counterattack moved quickly through the regiment. Senior commanders noted the unusual quiet in that particular sector following the day's engagement. Patrols confirmed reduced enemy activity. Reports suggested that the death of the Hauptmann had created a temporary lapse in German coordination, one that Soviet units exploited to reinforce positions before the next assault. One shot had not changed the war, but it had changed that street. And sometimes that was enough to tilt the balance for a day, an hour, or even a few precious minutes. Minutes meant survival. The sniper felt the truth settle heavily on him. He had not been trying to be a hero. He had been trying to survive a moment when the front threatened to collapse. Yet survival in Stalingrad often rippled outward in ways no soldier could fully predict. Later that night, he found a quiet corner to rest. His rifle lay across his knees, cleaned and reassembled with ritual precision. He ran a cloth along the length of the barrel, the scent of gun oil grounding him in the familiar. The tremor in his hands had faded. Not entirely, but enough. Across the room, two younger soldiers whispered to each other. "That's him," one said, barely audible. "The one who shot the officer." The other leaned forward, studying him. He saved the whole flank. They would have pushed through otherwise. The sniper kept his eyes on his rifle, pretending not to hear. Recognition brought its own complications, expectations, scrutiny, responsibility. But it also carried a kind of validation he had never experienced in training. Not admiration. Not praise. Belonging. A feeling that, in this ruined city, felt rarer than ammunition. As the hours crept by, the cold tightened around the shelter. Snow blanketed the street above. German voices drifted in the distance, frustrated, disorganized, their morale shaken. The silence between patrol bursts grew longer. The day's losses had clearly unsettled them. When dawn finally broke, thin and grey, the regiment commander made his rounds through the frontline shelters. He paused at the sniper's position, studying him with the careful eye of a man who weighed every soldier's worth in terms of utility and endurance. "You hit their officer?" the commander asked. "Yes, comrade commander." "Twice?" The sniper gave a single nod. The commander's expression remained hard, but the slightest shift, barely perceptible, hinted at approval. "You held the line," he said. "Good work." The words were simple. Not grand, not embellished. But in the brutal language of Stalingrad, they carried immense weight. Praise here was as rare as mercy. When the commander left, the sniper slung his rifle and prepared to return to his position among the ruins. The cold bit at his face as he climbed the stairwell back into the broken labyrinth of the city. The battlefield awaited him endless, unforgiving, indifferent. But he walked with a steadier step. Because now, the same men who once doubted him relied on his presence. The street he had helped hold would remain intact for another day. The regiment would continue to resist. The German offensive in that sector had stalled, their chain of command disrupted just long enough for Soviet defenses to tighten. One shot had brought him humiliation before. One shot had now earned him respect. And though the war raged far beyond this frozen city, his place within it was no longer in question. In the vast, brutal expanse of the Eastern Front, individual stories were often swallowed whole by the scale of the war. Entire divisions vanished into snowstorms of violence. Cities were ground into dust. Millions fought, bled, and disappeared without a name surviving the rubble. Stalingrad, perhaps more than any other battlefield, buried countless acts of courage beneath its ruins. But every now and then, a single moment rose above the noise, a moment that revealed something simple and human amid the enormity. A sniper who had been dismissed. Told he was too slow. Too hesitant. Useless. Yet in a single breath, on a single winter day, he made a choice that shifted the balance of a crumbling front line. Not through legend or destiny or myth, but through discipline, fear, resolve, and the quiet defiance that kept ordinary men fighting in a city where survival often depended on one decision made in the span of a heartbeat. War rarely crowns heroes. It merely exposes what already exists inside a person. His shot did not rewrite history. It did not decide the outcome of the Eastern Front. But it mattered to the men who survived because of it, to the street that held for another day, and to the soldier himself, who finally understood that value in war was not measured by medals or the opinions of others, It was measured by action. Across the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, thousands of moments like his flickered briefly, then faded into the sweeping tide of the conflict. But each one left a mark, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual resolve could cut through the chaos. And somewhere, in the cold silence after the shot, a young sniper found the strength he always had, waiting to be proven.